The morning she chose to put it on, the dress was still damp at the collar. It smelled of the lye soap the laundresses used in the basement kitchen of Ashfield House, that particular astringent sweetness that clung to coarse linen long after the rinse water had run clear. Constance Hartley had folded it twice before she pressed it flat across the chair at the foot of her old bed, the bed she had slept in for the first 22 years of her life, the bed she was no longer permitted to call hers. The dress was gray and unadorned, cut for a woman with broader shoulders and a thicker waist, and on Constance it hung at the cuffs and pulled loose across the back. She had borrowed it from Agnes, the under-laundress, who had looked at her with wide, careful eyes, and asked no questions, which was the only kindness Constance could have accepted that morning without coming apart entirely. She needed to see it with her own eyes. That was the simple and terrible truth of the matter. The invitation had arrived 3 days earlier, addressed to Miss Hartley, a small cruelty in itself since the household knew as well as she did that she was no longer Miss Hartley of Ashfield House, but merely Constance, the late Mr. Hartley's elder daughter, now that her stepbrother Gerald had inherited everything the entail could swallow. The invitation was for the autumn breakfast hosted by Lady Pembroke, held annually in the stone-flagged dining room of Pembroke Hall, attended by every family of consequence within 12 miles. Constance's name on the card had been her stepmother's doing, she was certain, a last gesture of contempt dressed as courtesy, because Dorothea Hartley had spent 2 years perfecting the appearance of generosity toward the daughter she had methodically dispossessed. Constance had been told, by the housemaid who still spoke to her, that Lord Ashmore would be there, and she had been told, by no one at all, only by the cold arithmetic of what she had overheard through the door of the morning room on a Tuesday evening 6 days past, what was being arranged in her name, and in Lord Ashmore's name, and what she needed to see confirmed before she could decide what remained of her life. She smoothed the gray linen over her hips and picked up the borrowed cap. Pembroke Hall received its autumn guests with all the ceremony the season demanded. Long tables had been dressed with white cloth and the last of the summer roses already fading to the color of old paper, and the hall rang with the collected conversation of 34 people who had no difficulty at all occupying a room while remaining, in the most fundamental sense, entirely unaware of one another. Constance had slipped in through the servants' passage at the eastern end, hat pulled low, a covered dish balanced in her hands as though she had been sent from the kitchen. No one looked at her. She had known they would not. The gray dress was, in the most precise sense, a disguise that worked because the people she moved among had already decided what she was. She set the dish on the side table and stood very still behind the carved oak screen that divided the serving area from the main room. She saw Lord Ashmore within 3 seconds of settling herself into that shadow. He was standing near the western windows, facing slightly away from her, a glass of claret held loosely at his side. He was tall in the way that courtrooms and drawing rooms tended to produce, a height that seemed less a matter of inches than of habit, a man who had learned early that rooms arranged themselves around his stillness rather than against it. His hair was dark, a deep chestnut that caught the pale autumn light and returned nothing. His profile, turned toward the woman speaking at his left, was composed and unreadable, the jaw set in its habitual line, the mouth carrying that expression Constance had catalogued in her memory over the course of 2 consecutive seasons as neither warm nor cold, but simply present, an attention so complete that receiving it felt like being observed by something that did not require acknowledgement in return. The woman speaking to him was Lady Pembroke's niece, Miss Dorinda Vane, in ivory silk with pearl earrings and the careful ease of someone who had been told her entire life that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Constance watched him listen to her. She watched the slight angle of his body, the courtesy of his attention, the way he did not look across the room or toward the door as lesser men did when politely bored. Then she watched her stepmother Dorothea enter from the far archway, and she watched the expression on Dorothea's face when she located Lord Ashmore, and she knew, with the certainty of a woman who had spent 2 years reading her stepmother's silences, that what she had overheard on Tuesday evening was not a plan in its early stages. It was a plan in its final one. You may wonder, as you settle into this story, what it costs a woman to watch her own future arranged as though she is not present. Stay a while. Constance was about to find out. She had lost Ashfield House in the winter, 2 months after her father's death. The entail stipulated plainly that the house and its attached farmland, some 420 acres of Cheshire clay, passed in direct line to the nearest male heir, which meant Gerald, who was her father's nephew by a first marriage long before Constance's mother had ever entered the picture. Gerald was 29 and smelled of horse and tobacco, and had visited Ashfield House exactly 4 times in Constance's memory, each time arriving with the air of a man conducting an inventory he had not been asked to complete, but intended to finish regardless. The loss of the house had been managed with the particular cruelty of paperwork and polite form. Gerald had written a letter. Dorothea had been present when it arrived, had been present with a composure so practiced that Constance had understood she had known it was coming, had perhaps known for some time. Constance was offered continued residence, at her stepmother's pleasure, as a companion, a function Dorothea defined as 1 part household assistance and 3 parts social silence. She had accepted because she had no other choice, and because her father's solicitor, Mr. Fenwick, who was 63 years old and had known Constance since her christening, had taken her hand in his office and said very quietly, "Except for now, Miss Hartley. Except for now." She had accepted for 8 months. To the county, she was known as the dispossessed Hartley daughter, a phrase spoken with the kind of sympathy that costs nothing and changes nothing. She had heard it first from Mrs. Gould at the Midsummer Assembly, spoken in the voice women use when they believe themselves to be whispering, and are not. She had heard it a second time from Gerald himself, who was not unkind so much as constitutionally careless, who said at the dining table one September evening that he had spoken to Dorothea about Constance's position, and that it was a shame, of course, to be the dispossessed Hartley daughter in such a thin season for connections. She had heard it a third time only 4 days ago in the voice of Lady Pembroke's own housekeeper, who had not realized Constance was in the passage beyond the kitchen door, and had said to the undercook, in the plainest possible terms, that the dispossessed Hartley daughter was expected at the breakfast, and would not Lady Pembroke be generous to invite her at all. 3 times. 3 settings. 3 people who believed it summed her up entirely. Constance had smoothed her skirts each time and given no visible response. The gray dress, as it turned out, was only the most recent garment in a long series of choices to make herself undetectable. Lord Ashmore's name had entered her story in the spring. He was Richard Calloway, the Earl of Dunmore, 35 years old, recently returned to the county after an absence of 4 years that had never been fully explained by the sort of people who made explanations their business. He had inherited the earldom from a father who had been ill for 3 years, and the inheritance had arrived in the same season as the end of his engagement, which had been called off by mutual agreement, the phrase the county used when a story was too unhappy to be made interesting. He had come to Dunmore Hall in March, and had been largely seen, and largely remarked upon, and largely avoided returning the remark. He had attended the Midsummer Assembly at the Pembrokes, and had stood for exactly 40 minutes before departing. He had been at the Gould dinner in August, and had spoken to fewer than 6 people. He had been to church twice, and had left both services without lingering in the churchyard, a small social economy that the county found impossible to account for. Constance had spoken to him once, in August, in the lane outside the lending library in Wenthorpe. She had been returning 3 volumes. He had been outside speaking with Mr. Fenwick, of all people, and when she passed, Mr. Fenwick had introduced her with the plain warmth of a man who had loved her father. Lord Ashmore had looked at her for a moment, that was perhaps 2 seconds longer than convention required, had said, "Miss Hartley," with a gravity that attached itself to her name and did not release it immediately, and had then returned to his conversation with Mr. Fenwick in the composed and unhurried way of someone who had not noticed that anything had occurred. She had noticed. She had walked the remainder of the lane with her books tucked against her chest and told herself she was being fanciful, which she probably was, and told herself it did not signify, which it probably did not, and had arrived home to find Dorothea entertaining Gerald in the drawing-room with the particular warmth that meant something inconvenient, for Constance was being discussed in the language of family welfare. The Tuesday evening she overheard the conversation in the morning room had come 6 weeks later. She had not intended to stop outside the door. She had been carrying a cup of tea to her own room, walking the long passage, and the door had been left an inch ajar, which was not Dorothea's habit, which was why Constance's steps had slowed before her mind issued the instruction. She heard her own name. She heard Gerald's voice, low and pleased with itself. She heard Dorothea's voice, which was never low and never careless, which moved through its sentences with the precision of a woman who had spent 30 years arranging rooms and dinners and social consequences to her exact preference. What she heard was plain enough. Lord Ashmore had expressed, through some channel she could not identify, some degree of interest in Miss Hartley. Dorothea had received this intelligence. And Dorothea had determined, with Gerald's easy agreement, that what Lord Ashmore believed he was interested in, and what was actually going to be presented to him, were not quite the same thing. The Hartley name was, in fact, the Hartley name. The particular Miss Hartley to be placed before him could be managed. Miss Vane was Dorothea's goddaughter. Miss Vane had tolerably good connections and a tolerable portion, though nothing that would satisfy an earl if the earl had his full attention about him. What an earl in his position required was a gentle redirection, a careful management of expectation, and the temporary disappearance of the woman he had originally asked after. That last phrase was Gerald's. Dorothea had paused after it, and then agreed, in 2 words, that this was probably simplest. Constance had carried her tea to her room. She had sat on the edge of her old bed and looked at the dark window, and done nothing dramatic, nothing she would have been ashamed of, nothing she would not have done had someone been watching. She had drunk the tea while it was still warm. She had folded her hands in her lap and thought, with a clarity she attributed entirely to the chill of the autumn night, that she needed to see it happen before she could know what she was willing to do about it. The gray dress had presented itself the following morning. In the dining room at Pembroke Hall, Dorothea made her entrance as she always did, not loudly, but with the calibrated precision of a woman who understood that the best entrances require no announcement. She crossed to Lady Pembroke with a greeting that was warm enough to be admired and brief enough to suggest she had more important business, and then she moved, with apparent casualness, toward the cluster of guests near the western windows, toward Lord Ashmore, and toward Miss Vane, who was already there. Constance watched from behind the screen. She watched Dorothea arrange herself at the periphery of the conversation and begin, without visible hurry, the work of drawing Lord Ashmore's attention from whatever it was currently resting on and directing it through a series of small social maneuvers Constance could recognize from 10 yards toward the ivory silk figure at his left. Lord Ashmore was polite. He was always polite. His eyes moved where Dorothea directed them, as polite eyes tended to do, and Constance thought, with a steady and cold clarity, that this was what she had come to see. The arrangement of it, the completion of what I heard through a door. She could not have said what she felt, watching. It was not weeping. It was not the kind of anger that makes itself known through heat. It was quieter than either. A thing with no name except the particular quality of knowing something fully that you had previously only suspected, and finding that knowledge smaller than you feared, because you had been carrying its shadow already for some weeks. She should go. She had seen enough. There was nothing here that the gray dress could protect her from further. She bent to retrieve the empty dish from the side table, intending to withdraw the way she had come, when the carved screen shifted. A footman, negotiating a tureen, had knocked the screen a quarter turn, and the shadow she had been standing in opened, and she was briefly visible to the main room. She did not move. She did not have time to move. Across 20 feet of stone-flagged dining room, over the shoulders of 34 guests, across a table of wilting roses and white cloth, the Earl of Dunmore looked at her. He had been turning away from something Dorothea had said. The movement of his turn had carried his gaze across the room in the standard arc. A man's gaze traces when his attention is redirected. And it had landed on Constance the way a thing lands when it falls without intention, and then does not bounce. He looked at her for 3 full seconds. In those 3 seconds he catalogued. She could see him catalogue it all. The gray dress, the borrowed cap, the covered dish. The serving woman's posture she had not quite achieved because she had not practiced it for long enough, and it was not native to her. And then, in the 3rd second, something in his face changed. Not dramatically. Not in any way that the 34 guests would have named had they looked. The jaw did not unlock. The eyes did not widen. What changed was subtler than any of that. A small interior adjustment visible only to someone who had been watching his face closely enough and long enough to know what it looked like when he was working something out. He had recognized her. She could see the recognition. She could see what followed the recognition, a rapid sequence of comprehension moving through his expression, like light moving across stone, too quick to catch in its individual steps. Only in its result, which was a stillness of a different quality than the one that had preceded it. He looked away. She withdrew through the servants' passage, the dish still in her hands, her breath even and her steps quiet. And she did not let herself think about what she had seen in his face until she was clear of the house and standing in the cold October air of the Pembroke kitchen garden, the herb beds cut back to winter stubs, the stone wall warm with the last of the afternoon sun at her back. She let herself think about it then. The question she turned over was not what she had seen. She had seen recognition. She had seen, past that, something that looked like the rapid processing of information arriving in the wrong order. Information that resequenced itself as he looked at her and produced a conclusion she could not yet name. The question was what he would do with it. She had been standing in that kitchen garden for perhaps 4 minutes, long enough for the sun to shift a half-inch on the wall, when the door from the house opened and Lord Ashmore came through it. He was still carrying the glass of claret. He set it on the edge of the stone trough near the door, with the absent precision of a man disposing of objects without thinking about them. His gaze found her immediately, which told her he had known where she had gone. He stopped at a distance of 8 feet and looked at her. "Miss Hartley," he said. She held the dish and looked back at him. "My lord, you came in through the servants' passage." It was not a question. She answered it anyway. "I did." He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the cut herb beds and lifted the edge of his coat and settled back down. Why? He said. She considered the word carefully. She had not permitted herself, in any of the 8 months since her father's death, to be careless with words, because careless words cost more than the careful ones. To see something confirmed, she said. I have seen it. I was leaving. He looked at her the way he had in the dining room, that same quality of attention that did not require its subject to be interesting in order to be sustained. What needed confirming? She weighed it. She weighed him. The steadiness of his gaze and the levelness of his voice, and the fact that he had put down the glass and come through the door rather than simply going on to the next conversation. I had overheard, she said, a plan that concerned me. I wished to see whether it was, in fact, being executed. The silence between them had weight. He had been very still while she spoke. And was it? Yes. Another silence. Longer. The sun on the stone wall lost another half-inch. She watched his face and saw the muscles of his jaw shift and settle, saw the minute adjustment of his standing posture, a tightening across the shoulders she had seen in the dining room too, but not understood until now. Who knows you are here, he said, in that dress. Agnes the under-laundress, from whom I borrowed it. No one else. He looked at the gray linen, at the cap, at the dish she still carried. How long have you been standing in this garden? Not long. Long enough to be cold. She was. She had not attended to it. It is of no consequence. Sit down, he said. There was a low stone bench along the wall. She looked at it, and looked at him, and understood the command for what it was, not authority for its own sake, but something more precise, more calibrated. She sat. He stood at 6 feet, not crowding her, not retreating. I wish to ask you something, he said, and I wish for an honest answer rather than a deflective one. Can you give me that? I have been mostly deflective for 8 months, she said. I find I am somewhat tired of it. Something moved in his expression. Not amusement, not quite. Recognition of a kind she did not expect. You know what was happening in that room. I know what has been arranged. I know whose interests it serves. I know which Miss Hartley I am in that arrangement, and which Miss Hartley is thought more convenient. He was quiet. I had asked Mr. Fenwick about you, he said after a moment. In August, after the lane. She had not known he had asked Fenwick. She absorbed this without letting it alter her expression. I had asked after Miss Hartley of Ashfield House, he said. Specifically, I was told that Miss Hartley was in good health and was residing still with her family. I was not told which Miss Hartley was intended by the reply. The cold of the stone bench had begun to travel through the gray linen into her bones. I expect, she said, that the reply was not intended to be quite so ambiguous as all that. No, he said. I expect not. There are moments in which everything a person has withheld for a long time presses at once against the place where withholding lives. Constance had been holding a great deal for 8 months, she said. Because she was tired of being deflective, and because the October air and the gray dress and the stone bench had stripped her of the particular kind of pride that keeps unnecessary things in. I did not come here to create a scene or to cause difficulty for anyone. I came because I needed to see what was being done, and I wished to understand it fully before I decided how to proceed. I am sorry for the intrusiveness of my method. You are not remotely intruding, he said. His voice had shifted. It was still level, still quiet, still the voice of a man who did not raise it. But something in it was different. Less controlled, perhaps, in the sense that control exerted over feeling produces a different quality of steadiness than control exerted over indifference. She looked up at him. He was looking at her with an expression she had not catalogued before, one that did not belong to the brief inventory she had assembled across 2 seasons, and she found she could not name it quickly, which was unusual for her. He crouched, which brought his face to the level of hers, the coat settling around his boots, and he looked at her at that distance in a way that was direct without being unkind, the way a person looks when they are trying to be certain of something rather than trying to produce an effect. "You are cold," he said, "and you came through the servants' passage in a laundress's dress to witness something done to you, and you have been standing in a cold garden for 4 minutes rather than confronting anyone, and you were going to leave without saying a word to me." She did not deny any of it. "Miss Hartley," he said, and her name in his voice, spoken at that distance with that quality of something no longer held entirely in reserve, moved through her chest in a way she did not have a precedent for. "Why were you going to leave without saying a word to me?" She looked at him directly. "Because," she said, "it was not clear to me that I had any right to say anything to you at all." He held her gaze for 2 seconds. 4, 7. The wind moved through the herbs again. Somewhere in the main house a door opened and voices passed and faded. "I am going to return to that room," he said, "and correct a misapprehension that has been allowed to persist for longer than it should have." He stood. He looked down at her, a look that was not distant and was not cold, and was something she would need considerably more time to name. "Stay here." She almost said something. She stopped. She stayed. The thing about waiting in the cold with a borrowed gray dress and the stone wall at your back is that it provides no occupation for the hands and considerable occupation for the mind. Constance sat and did not allow herself to speculate about what was happening inside. She looked at the cut herb beds and the stone trough and the glass of claret that had left a small red ring on the edge of the stone. She looked at the October sky, which was the color of pewter and moving, clouds assembling in their unhurried way toward the suggestion of rain. She folded her hands in her lap as she had on the edge of her bed on Tuesday evening, and tried to hold the same quality of stillness she had held then. She was not entirely successful. She did not know what he intended. She had no framework for it. She had been told, in more ways than she had been told directly, that she was not the kind of woman around whom frameworks were built. She was the kind of woman who observed the frameworks built for others and managed the arrangements they left behind. She had been told this by the entail, by Gerald's letter, by Dorothea's careful management, by 8 months of gradual and elegant exclusion from every room in a house she had grown up in. She had not been told it by Lord Ashmore. That single distinction was the thing she turned over while she waited. 15 minutes had passed, she estimated, when the kitchen door opened again. It was not Lord Ashmore who came through it first. It was Lady Pembroke. Lady Pembroke was 61 years old, a woman whose character had been forged in the particular fires of 50 years of county society, and had emerged from them with what could only be described as an earned tranquility, the kind that comes from having seen everything once, and most of it twice. She came through the door with the slow and deliberate step of a woman who had chosen her direction and saw no reason to vary it on approach. And she looked at Constance sitting on the stone bench in a laundress's gray dress, and did not, to her credit, show anything that could be called surprise. "Miss Hartley," she said, and sat beside her on the bench without being invited and without the quality of doing something gracious, simply sat, as though the bench had always held two and she had merely been waiting for the occasion. Lord Ashmore came through the door behind her and stood at the opening. Constance looked at him. He looked at her, His expression had been reorganized since she last saw it. But the reorganization was not concealment. It was something more settled than concealment. "I find," said Lady Pembroke conversationally, "that I have just had a very interesting few minutes in my dining room." She paused. "Lord Ashmore has informed me of an error in the management of certain introductions this autumn. He has been quite precise about the nature of the error and quite explicit about what he considers an appropriate resolution." She looked at Constance with the even gaze of a woman who sees clearly and says so only when it is useful. "He has also told me that you are in possession of relevant information that led you to attend my breakfast in a borrowed dress, which is, I must say, an approach to social intelligence that I find rather admirable in its directness." Constance said nothing. This was not the moment for talking. "I have known your father," said Lady Pembroke, "since before your mother married him, and I have known you since your christening. And I would like to say, now, that I have been considerably less attentive to your situation this past year than your father's memory would have wished me to be." She said this plainly, without self-flagellation, in the tone of a woman making an accurate account. "I intend to be more attentive going forward." From the doorway, Lord Ashmore said, "Lady Pembroke has agreed to speak with Mr. Fenwick tomorrow morning." Constance looked at him. "About?" "About the provisions of your father's will," he said. His voice was level, precise, the voice of a man stating facts that had been arranged into an order he has chosen deliberately. "Your father left you a separate bequest of £1,200 per annum, held in a separate trust, administered by Mr. Fenwick. You have not received any disbursements from it in 8 months. Mr. Fenwick had been waiting on a communication from your household regarding your current residence, which communication was, I believe, managed in ways that served certain interests other than yours." She stared at him. "Lady Pembroke has offered to write to Mr. Fenwick on the matter," he said, "independently of any other parties." Lady Pembroke said mildly, "Gerald is not a bad young man. He simply did not attend to the details because it did not occur to him to ask whether there were any." What had been done to her, Constance had understood, in a general way, for some months. What she had not understood was that what had been done to her had a precise mechanism, one that could be named and adjusted. She sat on the stone bench in the October garden and felt the mechanism she had been living inside become, for the first time, visible to her as a mechanism, something built by hands, and therefore subject to being unbuilt by the same. She said, with the care she always took, "I was not aware of the trust." "No," said Lord Ashmore. "I gathered you were not." Lady Pembroke rose, with the unhurried ease of a woman who had sat long enough. "I will return inside," she said. "I believe there are 1 or 2 conversations that need ending." She looked at Lord Ashmore with a slight inclination of her head that communicated very precisely that she was giving him something by leaving, and that she trusted him to understand it was given. She went inside. Lord Ashmore came to the bench. He did not sit. He stood at the end of it, looking at the cut herb beds and the gray sky, and Constance looked at his profile and waited. "When I returned to this county," he said, "I was not, in any practical sense, looking for something." He was quiet for a moment. "My engagement had ended badly. Not in the way those things are said to end badly for effect, but in the way that ends badly because I was not present to the person I was meant to be present to. And I knew it, and continued not to be present. And eventually there was nothing left to maintain." He said this without self-pity and without drama, in the flat voice of a man rendering an accounting of his own failure to himself out loud, which was unusual. I had been 4 years managing my father's illness, and the estate and the loss of my brother in the winter of 1816. I had been managing it by managing everything except what it cost me. She had not known about the brother. She had not known the 4 years' absence was that. "I came back to the county," he said, "because this is where the estate is, and where the work is, and because I thought that was sufficient reason to go anywhere." And then Mr. Fenwick introduced me to his late friend's daughter in a lane in August, and I found myself, somewhat inconveniently, attending to the specific person I was standing next to for the first time in a considerable while. He looked at her. The gray dress. The cold bench. October light on the stone. Constance looked back at him and did not let herself look away. "I was going to call on you," he said. "Properly. This month. And then what I had asked Fenwick about had apparently been, as you said, managed." He stopped. "I should have been more direct in August. I am aware of that," she said, because it was true, and because she was done with deflection. "You were not the only one who was not direct." Something in his face shifted, and this time she recognized the shift for what it was. Relief. The small physical alteration of a man who has been carrying something in his shoulders that he has now been, by a single honest sentence, permitted to set down. "Miss Hartley," he said. "Constance," she said. She did not know where that had come from. It had come from 8 months of being managed, and 6 days of anger, and 4 minutes in a cold garden, and the simple fact that she was very tired of her own name being used as a category rather than a name. If you are going to say something that matters, say it to Constance. He looked at her for a long moment. The wind moved. Somewhere behind the stone wall, a horse shifted in the stables and was quiet. "Constance," he said, in the voice of a man using a name for the first time in the full knowledge of what using it means, "will you allow me to call on you? Not through Dorothea, not managed, directly to you." She looked at her hands. They were in her lap. In the borrowed gloves she had put on that morning, the fingers slightly too long. She looked at them for the space of 2 full breaths. She said, "Yes." In the dining room of Pembroke Hall, Lady Pembroke was at that moment in conversation with Dorothea Hartley, and anyone who had been positioned to observe that conversation would have noted that Lady Pembroke spoke in the serene and unhurried way of a woman who has finished deciding something and is now simply making it known, and that Dorothea listened with the particular stillness of a woman who recognizes that the social authority she has been deploying has just encountered a social authority considerably senior to her own. Miss Vane sat at the far end of the table with her pearl earrings and her ivory silk, and the expression of a woman who has not yet been told exactly how the morning will resolve, but has already begun to suspect it has resolved without her. Gerald, who was not present, would be told by letter. Gerald would be surprised, and then would not be, and would eventually write to Mr. Fenwick with a confused good nature that in retrospect would look very like cooperation. Lord Ashmore returned to the dining room 20 minutes later. He spoke with Lady Pembroke briefly. He spoke with 2 other guests. He did not speak with Dorothea, who was across the room with Miss Vane, and did not approach him. And then he departed, having stayed longer than he had stayed at any gathering in the county that year, which was noted, though not yet understood. The understanding would come later, at the pace that county understanding always arrives. Constance returned the gray dress to Agnes that afternoon, folded and dry, and Agnes looked at her with the same careful eyes, and asked no questions. Constance walked home to the small room at the back of Ashfield House that had been her room since her father's death, and sat on the edge of the bed and thought about £1,200 per annum held in trust, and a man who had said her name in a kitchen garden in October, as though the word had been something he had carried for a while, and was only now permitted to set down. She did not cry. She had not cried since the evening Mr. Fenwick had held her hand in his office. She had used up most of what was easily wept in those early weeks, and what remained was not tearless grief so much as a different register of feeling altogether, something that sat lower and steadier, something that had been waiting, without knowing it was waiting, to be told it had permission to become something else. Mr. Fenwick arrived 2 days later with papers and the expression of a man who has been waiting a long time to do what he was about to do. He sat in the small sitting room with Constance and Lady Pembroke, who had come herself rather than sending a letter, and he laid out the terms of the trust with the precision of a man who had drawn it up himself at her father's direction in the last months of that gentleman's life, a man who had known, Constance now understood, that there were certain arrangements he could not prevent, but certain provisions he could make, so that his daughter would not be left without recourse, regardless of what those arrangements produced. £1,200 per annum, held in trust, released to Constance at the age of 22, or at the time of her marriage, or at the time of her independent establishment, whichever arrived first. She was 22. It had arrived 8 months ago. What she did with that information was clear to her before she had finished understanding it. She found lodgings in Wenthorpe, in a house on the better end of the Market Lane, 3 rooms and a small parlor, and a landlady named Mrs. Hollis, who had known her father and asked no questions and charged a reasonable quarterly rate. She arranged her removal from Ashfield House in the first week of November, with Gerald's confused assistance and Dorothea's cold silence, which Constance received with the composure of a woman who has already decided that she is no longer in a position where Dorothea's silence costs her anything. She took nothing that was not her own. She left nothing she would miss. Lord Ashmore called on the 6th of November, the first day she was properly in residence, with a calling card sent ahead in the correct form, and a punctuality that told her the date had been in his diary for some time. Mrs. Hollis showed him to the small parlor with the expression of a woman performing a ceremony she considers important, and he came in and sat across from Constance and looked at her in the clean morning light of the parlor windows and said without preamble, "How are you settled?" "Well enough," she said. "Better than before." "Good," he said. She had set a fire. The parlor was warm. Outside, the Market Lane was carrying its November traffic past the window, the creak of carts and the voices of tradespeople, ordinary and continuous, the sound of a town proceeding without requiring anything from her. He came twice a week for the remainder of November, and 3 times in the first 2 weeks of December, which was noted by the county at the pace the county noted such things, and understood by Lady Pembroke considerably sooner than the county at large, and understood by Mr. Fenwick, who noted it with the satisfaction of a man who had been waiting for it since the summer. On the 17th of December, there was snow. It came in the evening, the fine early winter variety that accumulates gently on window ledges and transforms the light in a room. Lord Ashmore had called that afternoon, and had stayed later than the correct hour, not by much, but by enough. And when they both noticed the snow had begun outside the parlor window, neither of them had moved to shorten the visit. He asked her, in the manner of a man who has thought about phrasing something for several weeks and has arrived at the simplest version, whether she would consent to be his countess. Not in those exact words. He was not a man who used exact words when plain ones would do. He said, "I am asking you to marry me, Constance. Not for arrangement. Not for management. I am asking you to marry me. Because when I am in this room, I am more present than I have been anywhere in 4 years. And I believe that is the best account I can give of what I am offering." She looked at him in the snow light. This man with the jaw like carved stone and the dark chestnut hair and the quality of attention that did not require its subject to be interesting, and the voice that said her name as though it had weight. And she thought of the gray dress and the cold bench and the Tuesday evening through the door, and all the months that had produced the particular version of herself sitting in this parlor on a December evening. "Yes," she said. He reached across the small table between them and took her hand, her right hand, ungloved, and held it in both of his, with a steadiness that was not dramatic and did not require to be, the steadiness of a man who has decided something irreversibly and has no remaining interest in performing the deciding. She felt the warmth of it. She felt the particular quality of being held by someone who was not calculating anything. She had not been held like that in a very long time. Outside, the snow continued. The fire settled in the grate. Mrs. Hollis could be heard in the passage, moving through her evening business with the tactful efficiency of a woman who understood that certain things proceeded best without her immediate presence. The market lane was quieter now, the traffic having given way to the muffled and particular peace of a snow-covered December evening. They sat for a while in that quiet. She did not move to take her hand back. On the mantelpiece, between two plain candlesticks, was the miniature of her father that she had brought from Ashfield House, the one that had hung in his study for as long as she could remember, the one she had wrapped in a shawl and carried herself so it would not be packed carelessly. In the painted oval, her father's face wore the expression it always wore in her memory of him, which was not happiness precisely, but the close kin of happiness, the expression of a man at rest in the knowledge that he had done the right thing. She had set the miniature on the mantelpiece on the first day. She had known, when she set it there, that it was a thing she would want to see from every chair in the room. She saw it now, in the snowlight from this chair. She saw the painted face and the painted contentment, and the small, quiet evidence of a man who had thought ahead, who had held a door open long before she had known she would need it, who had arranged what he could arrange and trusted that she would find her way to it. She had found her way to it. The fire settled again. The snow went on falling. Lord Ashmore did not release her hand, and she did not ask him to. And in the small warm parlor on the market lane in Wenthorpe, on a December evening in the last year of the century's second decade, there was nothing that required saying that had not already been said, or that would not wait until morning. If this story has stayed with you, carry it as long as it likes. The world is full of women in borrowed gray dresses who are waiting for someone to look across a room and see them clearly. They deserve to be seen.